So we're going to talk about social media, how we can think about it in terms of the behavioral sciences and the social sciences. And specifically, we're going to talk about relationship ties and networks, and also personality differences. So first of all, we need to sort of talk about some definitions and actually clarify what the questions are that we're going to ask and then answer. So what is social media and social networking? And I know that you've heard a lot of these terms and we all sort of throw them around pretty liberally, but I want to talk about how we define them in the fields in which they're studied. So social media would be defined as collection in any websites and applications that are used for social networking. Okay, so then what is social networking? This is just the forming of social networks. And so then what is a social network? Well, a social network is any set of relations, that is relationships or links or ties that exist among social actors. And that term social actors, what does that mean? Those would be all of us. All of us people who socially engage with other people. So this would apply to almost every human being on the planet. We are social beings after all. So reading and reacting to and responding to social situations requires examining more than just the most obvious social connectors, right? That would be groups and other social relationships, romantic partnerships and friendships and working relationships, etc. For example, people are often connected to others indirectly, right, by a third party or some other intermediary. So sociologists examine social networks in the study of social science. And the first step is to identify social networks. And we do this first by identifying the social actors who are connected through a network, right? And those actors, by the way, are sometimes referred to as the nodes of the network or the network nodes. And once we've identified who the social actors are that exist in a network, then we can identify the social ties that create links or connections between pairs of actors. So imagine a network like a big connect the dots image. So each dot or node is a social actor, and then the lines connecting those dots, these are all the different social ties. Okay, but how can we know which dots are connected to which other dots? And basically, how is a social tie created? Well, you can identify social ties by looking for what we call flows of resources or resource flows between social actors. So let's talk about some resources that often flow between people within networks. And there are several different types. And according to sociologist David Hatchin, who does a lot of writing in this area, in a social situation, there are several flows to look for. And then once you look for those different types of flows, you're going to start to see that social network. So the first type of flow I want to talk about are personal evaluations. And this is getting at looking at who likes who, and who is friends with who, and who avoids who, and who dislikes or hates who. So friendship networks or social cliques at church, or even prestige hierarchies within communities, these are all examples of networks that are created by these personal evaluations of others. Okay. Another type of flow would be the transfer of material resources. So this would be looking at how money and capital and commodities and services and other valuable material resources flow. So this would be focusing on exchanges in which A gives B something in exchange for B giving A something. And examples would include, who contributes to a local charity, or whom banks will lend money to and where they borrow from, and buying and selling in markets and things like that. Another type of flow would be information, and that is just simply who talks to who's communicating with who. And through networks, messages are sent and received, right? And this creates information networks. So information networks, they're important in anything from spreading gossip to actually learning about job openings and actually diffusing information about innovations, right? So information flow can be something almost frivolous, like fun and social, and it can also be something really important on which your job depends. Another type of flow would be the movement of people. So this would be looking for the flows of people between places, between organizations, even between occupations. So for example, some accounting firms, they'll recruit a large number of their new accountants from specific business schools. And occupations are often linked by the flow of people, such as the recruitment of principals from a pool of teachers, for example. Another type of flow would be the formal roles, and this would be looking at the rules and the regulations that prescribe basically who can tell who what to do. And command hierarchies in organizations, these are depicted in organizational charts, and these would be examples of that type of network where we have formal roles. And the last type of resource flow I want to talk about is kinship, and that would be looking for who is related to whom. And that could be either by descent or by marriage. That is genetic descent or by marriage. So once you start to see the social ties, the different types of social ties that can connect actors and then form a network, once you see that, then you can actually explore the shape and the character of that network. So again, once you've identified, what those social ties are and where they come from that make up a network, then you can start to look at the network itself. So here are some things to look for in networks. One is how dense is the network. So in dense networks, the ratio of the actual number of ties to the number of all possible ties is really high. So almost everyone is connected to almost everyone else. And then in contrast, in sparse networks, there are really few connections between a lot of the social actors. So networks can have regions in which density is high. These would often be called like cliques, for example, in which everyone is really directly and strongly linked to everyone else in that region, even if that region exists in a relatively sparse network. And then another question to ask if you want to look at the actual character of a network is, are there social actors who occupy sort of a central role in the network? So in some networks, there are social actors who are tied to many others, but then those others are not actually tied to each other. And an example would be like a hub network, in which everyone except the central actor has to go through that central node to then connect with anyone else. So centrality gives social actors a great deal of power because other actors have to go through them to reach any other nodes in the network. Another question to ask about networks is, how strong are the ties within the network? And some ties are, of course, more important than others. Indicators of the importance of a tie can be the frequency, for example, how often that tie is used. It can be the duration, how long that tie has been used for, and it could even be how intensely that tie is used. For example, how much information flows through that particular channel in that network. And then the last type of question to ask if you want to look at network shape and character is, where are there any structural holes between social actors? And structural holes would be the absence of ties. So often when we're looking at a network, a social network, we focus on the social ties that are connecting people, right? But the absence of ties can also be really important. So structural holes, they create opportunities for social actors to bridge gaps within a network. And this can happen by forming connections between, let's say, two previously unconnected networks, even two previously unconnected nodes within a network. So these are some of the ways that researchers in this area tend to think about social media and social networking. And let's talk about some of the directions of the research, some of the directions it has gone in, and some of the potential future directions of the research. And Eric Gilbert and his colleagues at Georgia Institute of Technology have pioneered a lot of this research and have conducted several studies. One discusses how social media basically treats all users the same. So whether someone is a trusted friend or a total stranger, there's really not much in between in social media, right? If you're connected to somebody online, you're connected to somebody online. But in reality, relationships fall everywhere along the spectrum, right? There's a lot in between a completely trusted long-term friend and a total stranger, right? So this is really that topic that social scientists have investigated for decades, and that's that concept of tie strength. In other words, how strong are the ties between two people? And researchers are really bridging that gap between the theory and the practice. So for example, Gilbert and colleagues, they devised a predictive model that maps social media data to tie strength. And that model builds on a data set of over 2,000 social media ties and distinguishes between strong and weak ties. And it tends to be, they found in following up with the actual people in interviews and whatnot, that it's at least 85% accurate. So this model they've developed is pretty good just by looking at information that's available online. So researchers also conduct interviews to complement those quantitative findings, where they will talk to people and unpack any kind of types of relationships that they can't predict with that model. So modeling tie strength can improve social media design elements, including privacy controls, message routing, friend introductions, and even the prioritization of information. And the researchers in this area also explore how well a tie strength model developed for one social medium actually adapts to another. So specifically, in one study, they presented a Twitter application that was called WeMetal, and that puts a Facebook tie strength model at the core of its design. So WeMetal, it estimated tie strengths for more than 200,000 online relationships from people in 52 different countries. And they focused on the mapping of Facebook relational features to relational features in Twitter. And they actually found that the Facebook tie strength model really largely generalizes to Twitter. So this is early evidence that important relational properties might manifest similarly across different social media, right? What is the case for Facebook is also the case for Twitter. And that's really a finding that would allow new social media sites to build around these relational findings from old ones. The next sort of general area of research and of interest in behavioral science has to do with personality differences and social media. And in particular, I would like to talk about the Big Five, because it's really impossible to understand the research in social media regarding personality differences without sort of knowing a little bit about the Big Five, which has been really the most common and robust sort of classification of different personality types. So the Big Five includes openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And these are considered the Big Five different personality dimensions that we're going to talk about. So the people who actually study the Big Five for a living, for their careers, are sometimes referred to as five-factor theorists. And this is the idea that basically our personalities can be broken down into these main five factors that are really considered the most important dimensions of personality. And of course, on each of these dimensions, we all vary in terms of where we lie. So, for example, first off, we'll talk about openness to experience. Openness to experience. This is the first dimension of the 5 that I want to talk about. So somebody who is high on this dimension would be open to new experience. This would be somebody who's very imaginative, somebody who's intellectually curious and broad-minded. And on the other hand, somebody who would be considered low on this dimension would be somebody who's concrete-minded, who is very practical, possibly very logical, and possibly has very narrow interests. Okay. The next main factor would be conscientiousness. Somebody who's high in conscientiousness, they would be very dependable, they'd be organized, they'd be reliable, somebody who's really responsible, somebody who's thorough and hardworking and persevering. And somebody who's low on conscientiousness, they would be someone who's undependable, probably disorganized, maybe impulsive, unreliable, irresponsible, or careless, maybe even negligent or lazy. The next dimension, it would be extroversion, and you've probably heard this term before, and now you can learn a little bit more about what it really means. And again, somebody who is high in extroversion, they would be considered an extrovert, and you've probably heard the term introvert. That would be somebody who is low on this dimension of extroversion. So extroverts, these are people who are sociable, they're outgoing, they're very talkative, they're assertive, they tend to be even persuasive, they're very decisive, and these are people who are active. On the other hand, introverts can be withdrawn, they tend to be quiet, passive, maybe retiring, and probably introspective. They tend to think inside themselves. The fourth sort of main trait of the Big 5 is agreeableness, and somebody who's high in agreeableness would be pleasant. They'd be good-natured. They are people who tend to agree with everything you say. They're very warm, sympathetic, and tend to be cooperative people. And on the other hand, people who are low in agreeableness, they tend to be less friendly. They can even be perceived as unpleasant. They can be aggressive or argumentative. They could seem hostile or vindictive, or they could just simply be cold and maybe even removed. And then the final of the Big 5, the final trait I want to talk about is neuroticism. And neuroticism is really referring to emotional stability versus instability. And sometimes the term emotional stability is used sort of in place of the word neuroticism, because a lot of people don't inherently know what the word neuroticism means. So what neuroticism is, somebody who's high in neuroticism, who's highly neurotic, would be emotionally unstable, right? And this would be somebody who experiences a lot of negative emotions, somebody who would be moody, irritable, they could be easily nervous, and somebody who tends to worry. On the other hand, somebody who's low in neuroticism and who's not very neurotic, they would be considered emotionally stable. They'd be calm and even-tempered and easygoing and possibly even seem more relaxed. So that's the Big 5 model of personality, and we're going to talk about how it applies to social media and what we can sort of learn from that. One of the questions is, what does research say about the origins and the stability of these 5 factors that we just talked about? So, in other words, how do we know we can trust the Big 5 to categorize personality? Well, the Big 5 are big because these are really reliable categories or traits that are relatively stable over time. So one of the big questions that all behavioral scientists ask is about heredity and environment. So the nature-nurture debate. And regarding heredity, for example, we know that IQ scores of identical twins are strongly correlated. Well, identical twins are also similar regarding several personality factors. Regardless of whether twins are raised in the same or different environments, they tend to share their factors on the Big 5. And nurturance, empathy, altruism, aggressiveness, and assertiveness, these are also substantially influenced by heredity, in addition to the traits of the Big 5. Genes influence extroversion and neuroticism more than actually the other dimensions of the Big 5, at least from what we can tell from the research. So heredity in general strongly influences personality, right? Adopted children, if you've studied behavioral science at all, you realize that we learn a lot about heredity by looking at adoption studies, and adopted children tend to be more similar to their genetic family than their adopted family. Genes constrain the environment's effects on personality traits. So it's not that the environment or the nurture can't actually affect personality. It's just that our heredity, our genes actually tend to put a constraint on that. And there are also significant age-related changes in those 5 factors. For example, openness, extroversion, and neuroticism tend to decline with age. Also, agreeableness and conscientiousness tend to increase until about age 70 and then tend to drop off. So let's talk about the research directions and regarding personality and social media. And the main question would be, the first main question to answer is, who interacts on the web, right? So on the web, which is increasingly user-generated, the personality traits of users are pretty crucial in determining who participates in social media and who doesn't. And the literature suggests factors like extroversion and emotional stability and openness to experience are really related to different uses of social applications on the internet. So, using a national sample of US adults, researchers at the University of Texas at Austin investigated the relationship between these really 3 dimensions of the Big 5 model and social media use. And they defined social media use as any use of social networking sites and also instant messaging. And they also examined whether gender and age played a role in social media use, and they found that while extroversion and openness to experience were positively related to social media use, emotional stability, that is neuroticism, was a negative predictor of the use of social media. And the authors did control for socio-demographics like socioeconomic status, and they also controlled for general life satisfaction. So overall, the findings did differ by gender and of course by age. And while extroverted men and women were both likely to be more frequent users of social media, only the men with greater degrees of emotional instability were more regular users for whatever reason. And the relationship between extroversion and social media use was particularly important among the young adult cohort. Conversely, among the mature cohort in the sample, being open to new experience is an important personality predictor for social media use. So we found these correlates of personality types and using social media. But one question is, are the differences robust enough that we can actually predict personality by looking at the extent to which someone's using social media? Well, social media, this is a place where users present themselves to the world and they reveal personal details and insights into their lives, right? So researchers are beginning to understand how some of this information can be used to improve not only the user's experiences with the interfaces themselves, but also the user's experiences with one another. So researchers at the University of Maryland have been looking at the personality of social media users. We already know that personality has been shown to be relevant in a lot of types of interactions. For example, it's useful in predicting job satisfaction, professional and romantic relationship success, and even the preference for different interfaces. But one problem with the research is that until recently, users would have to take a personality inventory, like a personality test, in order for us to know what their personalities were. And that's really impractical. So what Goldbeck and colleagues did was they presented basically a method of predicting personality type with just publicly available data that's on people's Facebook profiles. And the implications here are that social media can be really a relevant tool for collecting data for the sake of research in behavioral science. The third line of research that I want to talk about, it comes from researchers at the University of Bath and the University of Manchester, and they actually published a paper called A Tale of Two Sites, Twitter versus Facebook, and the Personality Predictors of Social Media Usage. Again, based on the premise that social networking sites are quickly becoming one of the most popular tools for social interaction and the exchange of information as well. And we already know that there is a relationship between users' personality and the use of social networking sites. So using a general population sample, actually a sample of 300, the researchers examined the personality correlates of social use and also informational use of the two largest social networking sites, and that would be Facebook and Twitter. And the personality dimensions that they looked at included the big five and also some others. So they looked at neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and they also looked at something they called sociability, and they also looked at something they called need for cognition. They also, of course, looked at age and gender, because we know age and gender are a couple of the major individual differences that help us to predict different types of behavior in general. And the results confirmed that personality was related to both online socializing and also information seeking and exchanging of information for both Facebook and Twitter. But the findings were really not as robust as those in previous studies. The strongest predictor of differences in the use of social media was age. It was far stronger than actually looking at personality differences. However, they did find a preference for Facebook or Twitter was associated with differences in personality. So actually, a series of one-way ANOVAs revealed that those who rate themselves higher in sociability, in extroversion and neuroticism, they actually had a preference for Facebook, but those who had a preference for Twitter, they were higher in the need for cognition. So in other words, those who are generally more gregarious and more sociable, they will actually look to use Facebook more often, while the less sociable individuals who are seeking more cognitive stimulation are more likely to look to use Twitter, according to those authors. And the final line of research that I want to mention was actually conducted as recently as April in 2013. It was on the interrelationships among not only personality traits, but also attachment style and interpersonal competency and Facebook use. And this was published in a relatively new journal called The Psychology of Popular Media Culture, if you're interested. So based on the idea that young adults are increasingly integrating social media into their daily lives and also into their social behavior in general, researchers are still looking at how personality traits and also interpersonal competency, that is how good people are at interacting with others, how those things associate with social media use, and also any potential consequences of using social media on social behavior in general. So the recent research is looking not only at the big five personality traits, but also attachment style and, again, interpersonal competency. Attachment style, again, is referring to our styles of attachment, whether they're secure or insecure, whether we tend to be trusting of other people, and whether we tend to have high self-esteem in our relationships with others. So using data collected from over 600 emerging adults, Jenkins and colleagues used structural equation modeling to test a theoretical model that explains those interrelationships of all those constructs, right? Personality, attachment style, and also interpersonal competency. And the results indicate that insecure attachment leads to more neuroticism. That's something we would expect. It also leads to less extroversion, which we would also expect. And it also leads to less interpersonal competency. And it also indirectly leads to less use of Facebook. In addition, when all the attachment styles are held constant, it seems that regarding personality, only extroversion was related to interpersonal competency and also Facebook use. So these results really highlight the role of attachment style and how important attachment style is when we're developing personality traits and interpersonal skills, and as well as our online social behavior. And all of these findings really align well with the existing attachment theory framework, which basically means that Facebook for example, acts as a social medium, much like any other social medium we would expect, like including clubs on a college campus, for example. So this also implies then that Facebook can be used in practice by even psychologists for the purposes of socialization, training, and so forth. So these are just a couple of the areas of research taking place looking at social media, not only in terms of what we can learn from it, but also in terms of who tends to use what and how often, and also what can we do with what we learn from it.